This photograph appears in the 506th Regiment scrapbook, a collection put together in 1945 while the regiment was stationed in Germany. Among the many images in that book, this one stands out as particularly fascinating. It captures three men whose roles were deeply tied to the formation and early history of Easy Company: Colonel Robert F. Sink, the regimental commander; Lieutenant Colonel Robert Strayer, who had commanded the 2nd Battalion before being promoted to Regimental Executive Officer under Sink in March 1945, and finally Captain Herbert Sobel, the first officer assigned to Easy Company and its original commanding officer. The later fate of Captain Sobel, specifically his removal from Easy Company in October 1943, is something that the series Band of Brothers never fully explained. This was likely due to the limited information available to the writers. In many cases, the show filled gaps in the historical record with creative interpretation, but in this instance, they simply left a noticeable hole in the timeline. What is known is that Colonel Sink reassigned Sobel to oversee the jump school at Chilton Foliat. Very little is recorded about Chilton Foliat itself. The facility opened in November 1943 as a parachute training and certification school, which was only about a month after Sobel arrived there. Because of that timing, it is quite possible that Sobel was present from the beginning and effectively helped open the school's doors, so to speak. During the 6 months that followed, more than 400 men passed through the program. Most of them were not frontline infantrymen but rather specialists, chaplains, medics, engineers, and other technical personnel who required parachute certification. Given the timing of his arrival and the nature of the assignment, it is quite likely that Sobel served as the commanding officer when the school first began operations, though the exact details remain unclear. There are also reports, ones that unfortunately cannot be independently verified, that claim Herbert Sobel jumped into Normandy on June 6, 1944, alongside the regimental headquarters company during the Normandy landings of the D-Day invasion. According to the story, he even earned a combat infantryman badge after allegedly leading a group of lost paratroopers in an attack against a German machine gun nest and knocking it out. However, no confirmed documentation of this action has ever surfaced. Ironically, another officer who received the same badge was Lewis Nixon, who famously admitted that he never fired his weapon during the entire war. After June 6, Sobel appears to have been sent back to England, returning to the jump school at Chilton Foliat. Evidence of his presence there survives in a certification document signed by Sobel himself. Interestingly, the document lists him not as commanding officer but as assistant commander. The scan of the certificate does not show the date, but records indicate that it was issued in October 1944. That raises an interesting question. Was Sobel originally the commanding officer of the school before D-Day, only to return after the Normandy operation as its assistant commander? The answer is uncertain. What is clear is that there is no record of Sobel participating in later major campaigns such as Operation Market Garden in Holland, the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes, or the fighting at Hagenau. It seems likely that he remained at Chilton Foliat in a kind of professional limbo until March 1945. At that point, he was assigned as the regiment's S4 supply officer. That appointment would have brought him back to the regiment, which at the time was stationed in Mourmelon, France. It was also there that the well-known exchange involving Richard Winters took place. The famous "we salute the rank, not the man" moment often associated with the story. Contrary to the way the scene was portrayed in Band of Brothers, the incident did not occur in Austria. In reality, the only other person present was Donald Malarkey. Malarkey later remarked that he thought it was somewhat poor form for Winters to call Sobel out over a salute given their complicated past. Still, he believed there was at least a trace of mutual respect between the two men. One can't help but wonder what Sobel must have felt in that moment. The first time he encountered Winters since the bitter court-martial saga at Camp Toccoa, now at a point where Winters was the superior officer, and being forced to salute him must have been a difficult encounter. Sobel's later life was reportedly troubled, and perhaps experiences like that played a role. After the war, Bill Garnier attempted to reconnect with Sobel but was only able to reach his sister. She reportedly told Garnier that Herbert harbored a deep resentment toward Easy Company. Sobel remained in the role of Regimental S4 for the remainder of the war, apparently without major incident, though there was one final interaction between him and Winters. Before U.S. troops left Germany, military policy required all issued equipment to be returned. Among those items were the silk maps issued to paratroopers before the Normandy jump. Maps designed to be durable, waterproof, and silent. As the supply officer, Sobel was responsible for collecting them. He wrote a letter to Winters requesting that his silk map be turned in or that he face a $75 fine. Winters' response was classic and characteristically brief. He simply replied with a single word: nuts. One can only imagine Sobel's reaction upon reading that letter. Since Winters was now his superior officer, there was little Sobel could do about it. Perhaps that small act of defiance explains why Winters kept the silk map for the rest of his life. Looking back at the timeline, one lingering question remains: how did Sobel manage to jump into Normandy on D-Day if he had already been reassigned away from Easy Company? One possible explanation lies with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Strayer. Strayer appears to have been a supporter of Sobel. During the famous Easy Company sergeant's mutiny, Strayer reassigned Winters to the position of battalion mess officer, a role Winters himself described as something typically given to someone incapable of doing anything else. Interestingly, in many interviews and written accounts, Winters mentioned nearly every officer in the regiment except Strayer, despite serving under him during operations such as Market Garden and beyond. Both men had also been present earlier at Camp Toccoa. If Sobel did indeed jump into Normandy, it may have been granted as a form of recognition for the work he had put into building Easy Company in its early days, as well as compensation for his transfer. Another indication of Strayer's support may be that Sobel was promoted to Regimental S4 around the same time Strayer himself became Regimental Executive Officer, suggesting that Strayer might have had the influence needed to make that promotion happen. Colonel Robert Sink, on the other hand, clearly held Richard Winters in high regard both before and during the war. He appeared to side with Winters despite Sobel technically being the superior officer at the time, and despite Sobel not having formally violated any articles of military law. Throughout the entire court-martial controversy, which ultimately never occurred, Winters never mentioned receiving any kind of reprimand from Sink. Some have even speculated that the dramatic moment when the Easy Company sergeants threatened to give up their stripes might have been quietly orchestrated by Sink himself. After all, he could hardly transfer every sergeant out of the company. The situation forced a decision. Knowing the leadership capabilities of both Sobel and Winters in a combat environment, Sink may have simply chosen the only practical option. This could also explain why Mike Ranney, one of the key figures behind the protest, was eventually allowed back into Easy Company, though only as a private. Another Sergeant Harris chose instead to remain with the Pathfinders for reasons that are still unclear. There were also rumors that Winters himself had encouraged the sergeants to revolt, though that claim seems doubtful. An officer in his position would have risked a genuine court-martial and removal from the regiment if such involvement had been discovered. It would have been an enormous gamble, especially given that Colonel Sink was known to have very little tolerance for breaches of military discipline. Winters himself later said that Sink had absolutely no patience for even minor violations of the military code. One example was the demotion of Lewis Nixon for poor performance even as the war was nearing its end. By appointing Thomas Meehan as Easy Company's commander, instead of immediately promoting Winters, Sink avoided the appearance of favoritism while resolving the crisis within the company. Looking at that photograph again, one cannot help but wonder what the relationships among those three men, Sobel, Sink, and Strayer, were really like. Sobel may have harbored resentment towards Sink, who seemed to keep him away from the front lines for much of the war. There is little evidence to suggest that the two men shared much mutual respect. Strayer remains something of a mystery. Despite holding a very senior position in a famous regiment, remarkably little has been written about him. Many of the veterans rarely spoke about him at all. That absence may even explain why, in Band of Brothers, Strayer sometimes appears to drift through scenes more like an aide than a battalion commander, or later a regimental executive officer. There was some correspondence between Strayer and Winters before the publication of Stephen E. Ambrose's book, Band of Brothers. Strayer was reportedly unhappy with aspects of what Ambrose had written, particularly because the author credited Winters with much of the battalion's success. Strayer was still alive when the television series aired and was said to support the project, though he found it difficult to watch. Perhaps the portrayal did not resemble his own experience, or perhaps he simply grew tired of seeing Richard Winters celebrated so prominently. In the end, that photograph captures more than just three officers standing together. It captures a complicated web of leadership, rivalry, loyalty, and unresolved tension within one of the most famous companies of the war. And it leaves us with an intriguing question. What did Sobel, Sink, and Strayer truly think of one another?